Hi, everyone. Welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I'm Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief with iPolitics, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Brian Storseth, the publisher of iPolitics. Today, we have two great guests, Aya Dufour, who is, of course, our major projects reporter, and Mélanie Richet with Earnscliffe Strategy. Thanks for both of you for joining us today. We have, unsurprisingly, a laundry list of discussion topics. It's been a very eventful few days at the start of the Hill sitting, the first time MPs have returned to their benches for 2026. A lot to go through, but let's maybe start there. Obviously, Parliament has returned, but once again, we see the specter of Donald Trump and global relations kind of dominate the headlines. I'll start with you, Mélanie. Considering everything we've seen, considering what we've seen the focus be on the trade disruptions, on Donald Trump's continuing / escalating tariff threats, is this going to be a terribly consequential sitting for Parliament in terms of the actual work we're going to see done in Ottawa?
That's a good question, and thanks for having me. One of the things that I keep paying attention to as the Prime Minister talks about what's going on south of the border and as he tries to diversify trade or build in Canada, I think he's been doing a really good job talking about how we strengthen our sectors, how we strengthen our industries, but has been doing a bit of a poor job telling regular people what that means for them. I think a lot of folks are paying attention to what's happening internationally, a lot of attention to what's happening with President Trump, but they don't necessarily know how the things that the Prime Minister is talking about is going to make their lives better. I think we saw some correction of that by the Prime Minister when he talked about the GST. I think the Liberals know that that's a weak point for them. How do they talk about cost of living stuff? I think while the primary focus of people is what's happening around the world and the threat of it impacting them here at home, I think they're still worried about how they're going to put food on the table and how they're going to pay their mortgage, how they're going to pay their rent. So I think we saw a little bit of that with the Liberals. It'll be interesting to see what that continues to do in the House, or if we continue to see the Prime Minister talking about kind of the high level of what he's doing. But even when he announces support for industry and whatnot, impacts for the workers who are being furloughed. So I think you're going to see an opportunity there for the opposition to take that up and say, who's talking about how we're not just supporting our industries, we're not just supporting our sectors, but how we're actually supporting our workers and our working families, and how, even from a communication exercise, does the Prime Minister go from that high level to how does this actually impact regular people, and how is this going to make regular people's lives better? I think that's the opportunity while Canadians are maybe paying a little bit more attention to what's happening around the world.
And Brian, I'm curious to see what you think, because that was one of the criticisms that, a few of the opposition parties, but namely the Conservatives, have been making, that you're making these trips across the globe, you're talking at Davos. It's sure, these are flowery words that are getting some global recognition. To Melanie's point, how can you translate that to what's actually happening on the ground? How is that going to affect, day-to-day life for Canadians? We saw yesterday, we had an affordability announcement. Just judging by the level of questions that the Prime Minister received, very, very few, I think maybe one, was focused on the announcement. Most of them were focused on Trump and the trade disruption. So, Brian, if you're advising the PM right now, like, how do you bridge that gap, to Melanie's point? How do you take the high-level language to the on the ground? Here's how this is affecting your bank account and your access to food and groceries.
Yeah, look, I think Melanie's absolutely right. I think the speech in Davos was a good speech. I think the Prime Minister's encapsulated a moment. I think the country is by and large behind what he wants to do, and he has a mandate to go do it. So really, at the end of the day, what the media often gets caught up in, sorry, Marco, isn't all so often it's about clicks and likes and views and audience size, and that's Trump all day long. But what the average Canadian is struggling with is the massive increase in food prices and some of these types of issues that are very difficult. Am I going to have a job? How much do I need to save? There was a report by the hospitality industry that said Canadians on average are only planning on going out once every 7 months now to go out for dinner. So these are very serious issues that people are feeling. It's the Prime Minister's job to now take the great speech and the flowery words, as you call it, and turn it into real policy that's going to have an impact on Canadians. I think if you look at the budget, part of the problem he has is the previous government's last 10 years has made it difficult. There's a lot of policies that they have to reverse. There's a lot of things that they have to in their own opinion, change because they've moved away from 2 or 3 of their different issues. And I think one of the things that drives me crazy, and I'm interested to hearing Melanie's perspective on this, is the impact of the new NDP leader once it gets picked up, because that is often a political place where the NDP will sit is the working families as well, right? So I think not having a set leader in the House has hurt that dialogue as well.
I mean, that's a great point in terms of those shifting issues. We saw early on in the mandate, the focus was on building. Obviously, it's not like that has somehow dissipated, but the Prime Minister made that speech in, I believe, November about doubling non-US exports. Once again, though, to both Melanie and Brian's point, like, how do you take that and turn that into a tangible affordability issue? You're obviously our major projects reporter, and you've been having your nose to the ground on this. Is that possible to bridge that gap to make that into a digestible issue for Canadians, saying, hey, that big project, that big mine that we may be fast-tracking approval for in northern BC or northern Saskatchewan is somehow going to help you if you're in Ontario, if you're in Montreal, and you're in Vancouver?
Well, I think this is probably a good time in Canadian history to look at energy and major projects issues. The appetite for it in the general population is very different. Now, how you're going to get people interested in the granulars of the policy, I'm not sure. Your initial question was, is this shaping up to be the least consequential sitting in history? I don't know, consequential versus exciting. I mean, we're going to see some conversations about developing a national electricity strategy. We're going to see how the government intends on making it an effective industrial carbon price. And these are policies that are going to sort of set the direction or the course for whether we're going to go ahead and build a new pipeline. And those big projects that are shaping the conversation about, whether Canada should be an energy superpower. And obviously that conversation is very much being shaped by the global issues and the geopolitical developments that we've been seeing in the past few weeks.
I mean, that's a terrific point in terms of, there is going to be some pretty consequential developments that are going to happen on things like energy, like things like power and electricity, and things in terms of industrial strategy. We're waiting for a defense industrial strategy to come out from Ottawa. But again, I feel like these things are so like in the weeds, in the bubble, not necessarily something that will translate. Melanie, again, like, if the Prime Minister gets up there, and I know that we're always chomping at the bit to talk about the election, but like, does he have enough to run on in another? Like, what do you point to? Oh, we put out the strategy. Does the average Canadian really care? Like, I feel like I have a tough time connecting the dots. So I can imagine someone who's not plugged into this, like, what their reaction would be.
Right. And all with this, with the caveat that the Liberals have only passed one legislation since they've been elected. So, the Prime Minister, I like to say, continues to act a little bit as a CEO and forgets that you have to work with opposition to get movement on the things that you want to get done, be it in the House or be it at committee. So what does that look like even that in the House when you talk about how important it is? Are we actually able to get stuff done and work together and meet the moment? But I do think, to your question of, are people paying attention? I think what we saw in the last election, I think that feeling is still there with people. I think folks are, when we look at public polling, you see that folks they're anxious. They're worried about what's happening. They don't totally know how President Trump's going to impact their everyday life. And they are willing to believe that the Prime Minister is going to do the things that he's going to do. He still has a lot of room in people's minds to get stuff done. People are still giving him a lot of space to match the strategies with actual action. For them, there's still capacity there. And I think people are empathetic that he's dealing with someone who's not rational in President Trump. Where I think that starts getting used up, or people's capacity for him starts getting smaller, is when they see those strategies and they don't see any actions. Again, going back to, you're talking about how you're supporting sectors, you're talking about these big projects, which, to Aya's point, they could set our country in a completely different direction, which could be good, could be bad, what have you. But until you're actually able to see some of that, I think folks still don't necessarily know how that works out. And the problem with these bigger projects is, it's not shovels in the ground tomorrow. It's not you're using this project in a few months, right? Like, there is processes that need to take place that take a while for folks to see the concept to like in practice. So I go back to, sometimes it's also a communication exercise. If you're not able to tell the story of how this is going to benefit people other than, diversifying our relationships, etc., you're going to have a really hard time with that capacity that people have given you. I think people in the last election, I was on the ground with Jagmeet, and it was impossible to say anything bad about Mark Carney to people because people were so desperate to believe that he was the person that they needed him to be to beat Donald Trump. And I think that that space that they've given him is still there. So as we move along closer to the next election and we don't necessarily see those concepts in practice, I think people will have less patience for him or less time for him. But I do still think we're in a period where, people like what he's saying. They like that he's serious. They see that they've, sent the adult in the room to have those conversations. And I think what we saw with the speech in Davos is exactly that. It was the adult in the room saying what people around the world wanted somebody to say as it relates to President Trump. So I still think there's a lot of time for the Prime Minister. But as we get closer to the next election, and to your point, those things don't translate into, my bills are less expensive. Food isn't, sky high at the grocery store. Until those things change practically, I'm not worried about being furloughed because I'm an auto worker and everything's happening. If those things don't change, I think folks will become less patient with the Prime Minister. And that's when you'll see his numbers change a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a terrific point. And we're already seeing them kind of wrap and try to create, a Mark Carney strategy, but also trying to wrap their agenda in his name. Government House Leader Stephen McKinnon yesterday was talking to us, and everything that he referred to about the package of bills that are still waiting for approval in Parliament, that's the Carney plan, plan for, the economy plan to deal with crime and drugs. And, Brian, I know maybe you might not love this concept, but, to Melanie's point, the PM is still very popular. It does seem like he has that bandwidth. If you're on the other end of this, and you're a conservative advisor, Pierre's leadership reviews later this week, what do you do? Like, can you, to Melanie's point, can you really try to beat down on the PM, or is he just kind of at this point, so popular that it's going to be tough to erode that if, we do have an election within the next year or two?
Well, I mean, it's the opposition's job to bring constructive criticism to the government. I think the opposition needs to start taking a hard look at the things that are being proposed and not so desperate to link it to Trudeau era stuff, but look at it on its merits and make a decision. And probably wouldn't hurt them after the leadership to actually support a couple things here and there that are pretty conservative in philosophy. But part of the problem with this whole situation is the fact that there's been for a year now a lot of great talk, but no action. Like, you talk about shovels in the ground. The only shovels in the ground are the ones on the major projects that already had shovels in the ground when they were being announced. So at the end of the day, Canadians aren't seeing a difference because there's been new bureaucracies created that are supposed to fast track some of these things. They're supposed to bring foreign investment into the country. But if the federal government's not willing to put money behind their own major projects, or at least back them through BDC or other ways, they're running into roadblocks. And part of the problem is because in order to really, my experience in the Harper government, in order to attract foreign investment, you actually have to have regulatory philosophies that people can buy into that aren't just about a single project. It's government-wide philosophies, So at the end of the day, I couldn't agree with Mélanie more and several others that you see talking about this. It's going to be interesting. Because the Liberals' time is on their side in that this amazing Carney strategy is going to unfold and all is going to be well. But I find it hard to believe that with the lack of action that we're seeing, that you're going to see a tremendous amount of movement overnight on things that are often out of the government of Canada's control, like inflation. Like what drives me crazy is the advertising. Some of the advertising is just ludicrous. Like, we can just buy our way out of this trouble if we just buy more Canadian. If we just invest in Canada more through Canadians, there's a real difference, and not trying to be the turd in the sandbox here, Marco, but there's a real difference between the Prime Minister's Davos speech, where he is spectacular, and he is, there's no questioning that. And then nobody wants to talk about 2 days later his speech at Quebec City, talking about the Plains of Abraham, and what a great moment that was for Canadians. he's much better abroad than he is at home trying to connect with Canadians.
Yeah, and Aya did a terrific story kind of latching on to some of that, Quebec City speech and how it kind of seemed to address or look at this kind of separatist sentiment. But Aya, you can explain this better than I can. That speech isn't going terribly well in Quebec. I know, Mélanie, too, you can probably speak to that. Like, is this someone who's, kind of, I hate to say this, but, lack of familiarity with domesticating politics is trying to catch up with him? Like, to Brian's point, you mentioned the Plains of Abraham. I'm obviously no Quebecer, but you can illuminate me. It doesn't seem like it'd be a terribly popular thing to bring up to Quebecers about the fight that the British won.
I know, I was so excited to see him in Quebec City after Davos, and my expectations were high, especially because I feel like Canada needs a bit of that unity speech right now. And then when he started talking about the Plains of Abraham and how that battle was a foundation moment for Canada, I was like, ooh, you're going to go there. You're going there. Okay. And then he bookended the speech going back to that. And, he did mention, it wasn't all great. There was dispossessions of Indigenous peoples and the Durham report, not good. But he sort of revisionism overlooked so many key moments that we learn about in school in Quebec about our history. No really mention of deportation of Acadians or hanging of Métis leaders or forbidding French language instruction in schools in Ontario. And that's not like it was like 400 years ago. Like that's not too far in the past. And Quebec people also have a very strong memory. Like they remember.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't surprised when some of the sovereignist, separatist movement grabbed that and it was fuel for them saying, Carney doesn't understand us. This is colonialism 2.0. I don't know how that'll translate in terms of support for Carney because Quebec did vote for Carney, even though he doesn't speak French. Well, he speaks French, but maybe not as comfortably as he speaks English. Let's put it that way. So I don't know if that means for the Quebec separatist movement or for Carney's support in Quebec, but it was definitely poor advice to deliver a speech like that right at La Citadelle, of all places.
Yeah, what do you think about that?
I would say I don't know that it's that he doesn't have a good grasp of Canadian context. I would say that he doesn't have good grasp at all of Quebec context. And this was one of the things that we talked about in March. I think it was around the Liberal leadership is it is one thing to be able to speak French and to be able to speak to Quebecers. It's a complete different thing to understand the different contexts and be able to connect with Quebecers. And that's where folks were saying back in March that Mark Carney may have a hard time understanding the context, understanding the values and the culture, and not just be able to say French words, but to actually connect with people. And I think we're seeing that play out over, obviously, with the speech that was not good. And like, let's remember, he was in Quebec City because he knows he has an issue with Quebec in particular. And we saw, even with the resignation of Stephen Guilbeault, that his clout that he was given by folks who are, well connected with Quebecers is kind of going away. And he doesn't necessarily have, if you're not going to be the person that can connect with folks, you need to be able to have an intermediary who's going to help you do that. He doesn't necessarily have that. I know he named, I can't remember who he named now, Joel Lightbound to do that. But Joel Lightbound doesn't have the same reputation in Quebec that Stephen Guilbeault, particularly in Montreal. So the ability to lend some of that credibility to the Prime Minister has gone away. And then you do silly things like this that hurt in a time which, Aya kind of mentioned that the timing in Quebec right now is really precarious as it relates to the separatism movement. And we've seen other things happen in the country that is spurring the conversation there. I remember when the Prime Minister signed the MOU with Alberta, and there was this idea of winners and losers, and winners being Alberta and losers being British Columbia. And a lot of folks in Quebec saying, pay attention to what's happening here. If he's willing to pick winners and losers in these provinces, we could be losers here. And at the same time, you were hearing about the new ambassador to the US and his comments on supply management and how that would be perceived in Quebec. So all of those things, one isolated moment won't hurt him, but all of these little things being added up not only will hurt him in Quebec, but I think will give a little bit more rise to the separatist movement. So how do you confront that when you're not plugged in is going to be really challenging. And as we know, this is something that is helpful to President Trump, right? That the rise of that movement is something that is helpful to his rhetoric as he's dealing with Canada. So it's particularly important to really nail this. So it was disappointing to see the speech and the lack of maybe understanding last week.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it definitely seemed like during that leadership race was something that Chrystia Freeland was trying to argue. I know she really didn't kind of, drop the gloves, but it was definitely the sense that like you don't have that presence in Quebec. But it seemed, to your point, Melanie, there were people who were willing to lend him credibility. I mean, he got some pretty strong support from the Quebec caucus. There were a lot of people out of the gates willing to go behind him with the idea that this is our guy. This is the only person who can win this election. You can kind of change the page here.
And it worked out.
Yeah, yeah, you can't fault them too much there, right? But yeah, I mean, but also we saw, in terms of action, I mean, Brian, the fact that, the first big kind of provincial spat that he kind of settled was the Alberta MOU. Does it kind of signal that, those priorities seem to be, fixated on Western Canada? Let's also talk about the China deal. I mean, the big winners, if you look from a Canadian lens, they're all either East Coast, seafood producers, they're West Coast agricultural interests. I'm not trying to say, we don't, necessarily have, beef and, canola in other parts of the country, but that's really where it's heavily concentrated. Is this a prime minister who's a bit too Western focused? I would imagine that Brian would hate that, but I'm just curious.
No, but like we can't be so naive as to think that oil and gas is only a positive impact on Western Canada. The production of oil and gas and the agriculture industry across the country are key factors in inflation. And so the more places we can trade our products, the more of our products we can produce creates more jobs, and it reduces the amount of inflation in our country. So the prime minister didn't go do that because he thought he was going to win 8 more seats in Alberta, because he's not going to. At the end of the day, it's good for the country. When Alberta is producing its natural resources in Saskatchewan and Atlantic Canada and Ontario and everywhere else, it's good for the country. So I believe that's why he did it. I believe we need to diversify. As I said last week, we got to diversify away from, we're never going to get away from the American market. It's like 80% of where we sell our goods, but we can sell less of our goods there so that we have more capacity. One of the things, quite frankly, when it came to Western Canadian canola, Marco, was when China put the tariff on, was a massive success. I heard from guys in the ag industry because they found other markets to sell it to. They really didn't have a massive negative impact on the canola industry this year. It might in the years to come. And I think the deal that was made was a positive deal. But I think it was made because it was in the best interest of the country as a whole, including the best interests of Ontario, which is why you saw the Premier of Ontario, let's say, adjust his position fairly quickly in the last few days. But I'd make one other comment before we totally get off the Davos piece, Marco. I think you're really seeing, like, today's so much about social media algorithms. I was having this conversation at home with my kids on how so much confirmation bias is seen everywhere, right? And that's what people want to see. And I think you saw the worst of both sides for Canada. We saw the best and the worst. We saw the Prime Minister's speech, which was inspirational, and it was a great speech. We saw right-wing influencers over there asking absolutely ridiculous questions and saying stupid things that only hurt their image in Canada. But then, like, you've seen Justin Trudeau and former cabinet ministers representing other countries over there and being there. And it's not, that also hurts the Liberal side. So, like, there was so much to be unpacked in that. I've never seen a Davos trip with so much going on in it from the Canadian perspective. I feel like you could have 5 episodes just on that. But moving forward onto the agreements, like, you're going to see, and this is the comment I made about Ford last week, like, there will be agreements made with countries that are beneficial to Ontario more than anywhere else. It's just the way it's going to be. But at the end of the day, we need agreements. We need to trade with other countries.
Yeah, Brian, I was going to say, it's so surprising to see Premier Doug Ford change his position or somehow shift focus. He never does that, right? So it's surprising to see him.
This was particularly quick. It made me for a moment wonder, like, has Corey been gone too long? Is he already? This was a really quick turnaround.
I would say, though, like, to give credit to Doug Ford, he has been really good at feeling the pulse of people and being good at apologizing if he makes a mistake or correcting course if he's not tied to the feeling of folks. So credit's due. I think he saw that folks were cautiously optimistic. I don't think folks are, hoping that we put all our eggs in the China basket, but I think are cautiously optimistic that diversifying our trade will be good. I do think the problem in that interaction was it sounded like the prime minister didn't line up his champions, right? When you're about to announce a big thing, you want to make sure that all your people have the information that they need so that when you announce the thing, they know what's happening, they know how it's impacting them, and they know what's coming to support their sectors. And what it looked like on that Friday was instead of lining up, Lana Payne at Unifor, who's been a great ally of this prime minister, instead of lining up Doug Ford, who's been a good ally of this prime minister, with the things that they needed to not criticize the deal as it relates to auto manufacturing, he didn't really have anything to say other than, we've got a plan, it's coming in a few weeks. So had you done that dance beforehand, you may not have seen what we saw. So again, how do you build those champions? How do you communicate properly? How do you bring the people in so that you're not having to kind of correct and lose momentum with that, I think is an interesting lesson from the prime minister's side, actually, despite it was kind of funny to see Doug Ford with pizza with the prime minister yesterday after being so upset.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess, Melanie, this is to your point of, it seemed like early on that it was easy for the prime minister to make friends, to get allies behind him. We were all united. And, when you're going to make a trade deal, you're going to have some losers, some winners. So if you're going to be in a tough position, to your point, it seems like you need to rally your support or to at least explain that. I guess the caveat I would put to that is, we saw with the Canada-US deal, they were so close to getting something completed, and then those anti-tariff ads blew up. Doug Ford kind of attributed to the fact that autos weren't part of this deal. I don't want to, say that Doug Ford is somehow trying to undermine these deals because of that. But is that maybe a reason why you keep Doug Ford in the dark?
I think so. And the reason I don't think so is because when the ad first came out, Donald Trump was like, oh, it's super cute. I would be doing the same thing if I was them. I think it's really smart. I think Donald Trump, you will use whatever Donald Trump needs when it suits him. And I don't think there's anything that we could do positive or anything we can do negative that's not going to upset this guy. The prime minister's Davos speech, which set him off, and the China deal, which again, at first he said, I'd be doing the same thing. I think it's really smart that Canada diversifies their trade. And then, a few days later, it's 100% tariffs if they go ahead on it. And the same thing with the ads. So I don't actually know that anything that we're doing is causing the rips in the relationship there. I really think we're dealing with somebody unpredictable, unreasonable, and unreliable who, when it suits him, will throw a shot in and tear the whole thing up. And I think that that's what we're dealing with. And I do think that that's why folks have a little bit more patience with the prime minister and with the premier, because it's somebody so unpredictable.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about that, Brian? Should we keep Doug Ford in the dark so he doesn't?
No, look, I absolutely agree. I think Donald Trump is absolutely erratic. You can't base your policy on Donald Trump. That's been proven out, or your decisions. At the end of the day, I think that had they obviously had the conversation with Premier Ford and his team before, as Melanie said, obviously they wouldn't have had him out there railing on them for 2 or 3 days or whatever it was before he adjusted his position quite sharply. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, you got to keep as many of these premiers together as you can, and that is a difficult thing in federation. No prime minister has ever. I've never seen a prime minister at the end of their term be, man, I love those first minister meetings. They're such great.
Well, it does seem like he's keeping the team mostly together. I mean, even Danielle Smith has kind of been as kind of punchy with. I mean, that being said, I don't know what she's going to pick a fight with him over. But what's your read on that? It seems like the fact that we're having these separatist debates is interesting because it comes at a time where we're not really seeing a lot of disunity. Even Scott Moe's given the PM, a liberal prime minister, a pat on the back. So what is going on here? Why are we talking separatism at the same time our premiers are all singing Kumbaya?
Yeah. I don't know about how quickly Ford changed his mind on the auto sector. It made me think that there might be something coming in the pipeline, an announcement, a measure, a strategy for the auto sector that maybe wasn't fully formed when they made the deal with China. And maybe that's why there wasn't that outreach with the Ford government. And now 10 days later, there's a bit more time. Maybe the details are more fully formed and he saw something that reassured him. I don't know. It is an interesting time as we're having this conversation about we're stronger together against bigger threats, that you still have these separatist movements in the country. It seems like of all the times in Canadian history, this would be the time to band together because there's this bigger outside threat. I think Quebec's separatism never goes away just by the nature of how Quebec came into Confederation. Alberta is an interesting one. And I think the Prime Minister's office is very concerned about the rise of separatist sentiment there. I think that's the only reason, really, that we saw this MOU come about. I don't know. My read on it is that it would probably be sufficient to quell some of that sentiment, that Western alienation, because it addresses key concerns that Alberta had.
Maybe if I could just add, if you don't mind quickly, what I find fascinating about the whole, particularly in Alberta, is it seems to be the work that the Prime Minister has done, particularly with Danielle Smith and with Scott Moe, has been to bring them more on side, to bring them more in the bubble as more constructive, members of the big family. But the interesting thing on the ground, we saw, at the UCP convention, is folks booed that section of the speech when she talked about the work that she was doing, the Prime Minister, on the MOU. So it's interesting that it would be interesting to see the kind of different levels of how is this helping bring people in places like Alberta, but who is it bringing in and who is there there's no shot at speaking to. And I do think the section of the no shot, maybe the folks who were upset when the Premier talked about that, are also perhaps the same folks who are talking about, well, maybe joining the United States would be a good thing. So I don't know that you're ever going to get a win with, the maybe 10% of people who are loud and angry. But for other folks who see a more reasonable and pragmatic approach from the Prime Minister as it relates with Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular, I think folks appreciate that and see kind of like a olive branch a little bit of how do we work together. So I do think I agree with you that you're seeing a quelling of a little bit, but I don't think that loud, small percentage is ever going to go away, maybe in the same way that we do see in Quebec, although I would say in Quebec it's probably a little bit louder.
Mélanie, did you used to work for the NDP?
I did, yes. I worked for Tom Mulcair and then for Jagmeet Singh in the leader's office.
And are you still involved with the party? Or?
I still have a lot of opinions, still have a lot of friends who are involved. I'm a little bit devastated by our leadership race.
Are you?
I am the kind of New Democrat from an orange-blue riding who's a New Democrat because I think the NDP is the party that helps regular people. It's people who are like moms who are worried about their kids and who are worried about their parents. And I think the NDP is the party that helps those folks make ends meet and put food on the table. And I just feel like unless you're able to talk to people in a way that people understand, you're never going to get people to come in to you. And this whole conversation about are you progressive enough to be a New Democrat? I find really challenging. I always would look at my girlfriends who are my age, who have kids, who should be New Democrats, but would take a look at the NDP and be like, y'all are nuts. The way that you argue and try to decide who's, a New Democrat, who's not. And that conversation just kind of continuing, it breaks my heart a little bit. I don't think the lesson of the last election was getting real stuff for people is what led to the loss. I think the lesson of the election was when the cards were stacked against us, nobody thought we were credible. Nobody thought we were credible as it relates to Donald Trump. Nobody thought we were credible as it relates to governing in this serious time. And that's what we need to tackle, not our ideas weren't bold enough or our ideas weren't, progressive enough. I think we need to be bold. I think it's so important to be progressive, but people don't actually see themselves that way for the most part. They have the same values as us, but the arguing on that means that we're not talking about how we're going to make their lives better. And I worry a little bit about if Avi were to win, what does that mean for folks? What does it mean for working people who see themselves as part of our party? I just feel like it would be a bit of a rejection of all of that. And yeah, it worries me a little bit. I've dedicated my adult life to this party. So to see it go down to 7 seats was pretty devastating. And anyway, a lot of thoughts, but I'm not involved in any of the campaigns because I'm still a little bit heartbroken by it all. So I'm taking a little bit of a break.
Sounds like a really good op-ed, Mélanie.
Pardon?
Sounds like a really good op-ed.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I feel like I need to put my thoughts down without taking direct shots at Avi. So yeah, maybe that's a way to do it.
Oh, Brian, you're back.
I'm back. Yeah. Apparently a little bit of snow affects our internet.
The internet, the LRT, all of the things.
So I missed it though, Mélanie. Who do you think is the best choice for the party?
I would love for people to choose Rob Ashton. I think he has the most potential. But I think it's the most untested, and Jagmeet had a lot of potential too. And that didn't necessarily, and I say that Jagmeet is one of my favorite people, but it didn't necessarily play out. I think Rob Ashton is perfect foil to the Prime Minister because the Prime Minister has spent his whole life being in charge, and Rob has spent his whole life with working people. And I think he's a good foil to Pierre Poilievre because he's who Pierre Poilievre pretends to be when he talks to working people. So I feel like that is a really good for our orange-blue ridings, but also really good for our orange-red ridings. But he's the most untested. So I worked with Heather. I really liked Heather. I don't know that she's surrounded with the people who give good advice. And that's like your number one criteria for a good leader is it needs to be somebody who listens to smart people and who doesn't just, and yeah, I've gotten into a few too many of those with Heather. So I know what Heather gives us because I was with Heather for so long. I know what Avi gives us, or I have an idea of what Avi gives us. The Rob is like the unknown, and I guess psychology tells you that you would be more willing to bet on the unknown, like everybody maybe did with Mark Carney, than what you do know. So I like the potential of Rob, but again, it's potential, so hard to say.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
Brian's a big Avi fan, so you might have offended him.
Jeez, I mean, if Avi wins, Alberta NDP, perfect excuse to no longer be tied to the federal party. Saskatchewan NDP will follow. Manitoba NDP will follow. BC will follow. And then we have no ability to fundraise to get members because we lose all of that data and all of those because we're so intricately tied to our provincial sections that it'll be anyway.
I'd be curious to hear you about Charlie Angus making that comment that NDP leader is not an entry-level job.
Yeah, so that's specifically, I have a lot of time for Charlie. I like Charlie a lot. The last election, Charlie, did his Ontario tour and didn't tell people to vote NDP. He told people to not vote Conservative. So for somebody who dedicated his whole life to the NDP, which, we lost a lot of our seats in Southern Ontario to Conservatives because of the orange-red split. Again, you can tell that I'm still angry about the last election. I have a lot of feelings about how that went down. So I was a little bit upset about that. As it relates to entry-level job comment, I think it was an easy thing to do because it hits both Avi and Rob if you're backing Heather. And it kills me that a qualified woman, I'm like, I would rather the potential of, somebody, an untested old white guy like Rob than Heather. But I've worked with Heather and, just you need to have good people around you. And she has a few folks around her that don't give good advice and she listens to that advice. And I think that it's really important to know what is good advice and what's not. And to know to surround yourself with people who aren't going to tell you what you want to hear. And sometimes you can learn that and fix it, but it doesn't seem to have necessarily worked. So that's why, I mean, if it means Heather or Avi, I'm 100% putting all my votes behind Heather. But I would like to see what could happen with Rob. But again, it's the untested thing that I think a lot of folks have questions around.
Who's in the catbird seat? Like I wasn't kidding when I said the media is not covering this enough. Who actually do you think is the favorite right now
for the NDP? Oh, it's definitely. I think Avi is getting the most memberships. I think Avi is organizing the most memberships. I think it's his to lose. Again, he has to win it on the first ballot. If he doesn't win on that first ballot, he loses. But I think that's definitely, from what it sounds like, other than other parties holding back their membership numbers, it definitely sounds like he may be. So our leadership race is a little bit different than others, right? Where it's a 1-per-1. So every vote counts. So it's really a membership game. Whoever can sign up the most members wins. So it sounds like he's getting a lot of numbers.
Really? Wow, that's my uneducated opinion. That's good for Carney.
100%. It's good for Carney. It's good for Poilievre. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not good for Conservatives to not have an NDPer that can get to that.
You say that traditionally, but we lost 17 seats and 11 of those seats went to the Conservatives. So the Conservatives would have a lot less seats right now. And the Liberals would probably have a majority if it wasn't for those 11 seats. So I think the Conservatives actually really benefited from us not doing so well in the last election. Anyways, I can keep going unless you want us to get back on track. I have a lot of thoughts.
No, but I agree with you, except the Conservatives hit a home run in it, and it still left them far beneath where you would ever get to a majority government.
Vote splitting gave the Conservatives all our seats on the island except for Gordon's seat. That's if you look at the vote splitting on the island, the NDP would have held on to those seats if not for the vote splitting between Orange and Red team. So those seats were picked up by the Blue team. And the same thing in Southern Ontario. The three-way races meant that the Blue team was able to slip up the middle with the vote split. So those 11 seats don't get tossed to the Blue team. I think maybe there's 1 or 2 seats that it was a pure orange-blue race and the Blue team won handedly. But the majority of them, we lost because of strategic voting in ridings where the Liberals were not poised to win. So that that's Carney's majority.
But we can get those 11 seats traditionally in Peel if the NDP is higher and we maintain.
No, those seats are orange seats. Those are not blue seats. Those seats are orange seats handedly if you're doing well.
Yeah, I'm saying if we don't have those seats, but those we traditionally would come up through Lakeshore all the way up through Brampton, we get those seats.
Our vote collapsed in those regions.
That's my point.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
Collapse,
we split the vote in those.
If you guys get 18% of the vote, and Jagmeet got 16.5 his first run, you guys get 18% of the vote. Peel region goes blue, and there's a lot more seats. It's the old fight. We're picking up more rural seats off of kind of rural seats off you guys than fighting in the big cities. The vote splitting helps us in the cities. You guys being competitive in the Muslim community and some of these other communities in Peel region, Scarborough, and some of these is far more beneficial from a pure seat wise for the Conservatives traditionally. I mean, Pierre and Jenny went a different route and went after the NDP, which that's the theory that
It's always my favorite thing when they're like, well, the NDP collapsed and that's why we lost. I'm like, do you know how much money you spent going after me? You spent more money going after our guy than you did after Carney. That's why.
To the point where guys were so angry that Charlie Angus and even to some degree Jagmeet kind of blocked for Carney, it seemed at times, because they were just so angry at Pierre and how aggressively they went after them, right? Didn't make sense.
You could argue that the debate, I mean, Jagmeet just did not let Pierre breathe. He was down his throat the whole time in the English debates. He definitely, to Brian's point, I think he definitely held his fire on Carney. And I think maybe that was an appealing message to the NDP voters at the time, though.
Yeah, so polling showed us 2 things. In orange-red ridings, where we typically had people voting for us, it was, we love you. We love what you're doing. We want more of you in Ottawa to keep the government responsible. But we're scared of Trump and we're scared of Poilievre. So we're voting for Carney. But if we think Carney has the majority, we're taking our vote away and we're giving it to you. And on the flip side, in orange-blue ridings, it was, we're terrified of Trump. We can't stand the Liberals. We're voting for Poilievre. But if we think the Liberals are going to win, we're going to vote for you. And it was just fascinating that in both of those ridings, we were hearing the exact same thing, but the opposite. But it was that's it. Your guy's saying everything he needs to. It's just too important. And you're like, yeah, I know. I feel you. People in my family are like, guy, Donald Trump's scary. I need to vote differently this time. Anyway.
I mean, I wanted to actually bring it back to the peer leadership review, because that's one of the things I did hear from pollsters and from people inside the Conservative vortex was, there's a big decision for Pierre. I think he's already made the decision. I don't think people are trying to say he's going to somehow magically pivot, but they're trying to frame it a bit as do you double down and try everything you can do to keep your coalition together, or do you try to expand your vote, your potential voter pool? I don't think Pierre's ever going to do the latter, but it was the sense of, if you stick to the former, if you try to keep your team together, you're just banking on the NDP recovering. You're banking on the Liberals slipping a bit or someone else filling that void. Brian, is that a fair assessment that Pierre is in a position right now where he has to make something, that we can call a pivot or not, and that if he does opt to not change his approach, poll after poll shows he's personally not as popular as a prime minister, and that may be getting worse, that something has to change, or else he's just banking on factors that are outside the control of the Conservative Party?
Yeah, well, look, first, I don't believe we elect opposition leaders in this country. I think we ought to elect prime ministers. So Pierre's got to maneuver through that. And the other aspect is, I don't see him doing this magical pivot that the media so desperately wants him to do. At the end of the day, young Canadians, he's put a coalition together of people that are willing to vote for him that is enough to win in normal circumstances. And if what he's banking on, I think it's more he's banking on the Trump issue isn't the number one issue in the next election. Because if the Trump issue is not the number one issue, and it's affordability, it's the economy, it's healthcare, it's things that the Liberals arguably have made worse over the last 10 years, then somebody that's not the prime minister is going to win the election. And if it is the issue of today, Trump, foreign affairs, which very seldom in our country do we vote on foreign affairs as our ballot box issue, or if the Liberals are able to somehow regain the upper hand on some of those economic issues and they're not the number one issues, then I think there's an opportunity there for a re-election for the Liberals. You know, the base of the Liberal Party has undergone a massive swing away from Trudeau, and I think there's a cohort of voters that nobody talks about sitting there that really don't want to vote for Carney that I think would potentially swing NDP with the right NDP messaging. So back to Pierre, he's not going to change his position. He ran initially on the fact that Aaron O'Toole absolutely went from like the hardest right person in the leadership to the reddest person you can imagine, even on carbon tax. Pierre's allergic to being that guy. He's not going to be that guy. Pierre Poilievre is going to be the person that says the same thing in Crowfoot, Alberta, as he says in Ottawa. And that's what he's banking on Canadians will buy into.
Melanie, you made a good point too about how nothing was, in terms of the NDP vote collapse, this was not, incidental or accidental, and that the Conservatives put through a lot of money and effort towards undercutting the NDP. And it sounds like Brian's saying they don't necessarily need the NDP to recover. They just need some of those maybe older Canadians who backed Carney because he was a stabilizing force. But again, like I guess the contrast to that is it also seems like Pierre Poilievre might be a bit distasteful to some of those voters who, to Brian's point, usually line up to the Conservatives. Like, is Pierre the problem here? Like, are we beating around the bush here? And he's just not going to be able to convince some of those people who definitely should, in other elections would be in the Conservative camp to come back to his party.
I definitely think so. I was just thinking this is the first time I've disagreed with Brian throughout the call. I definitely think that Pierre Poilievre is the problem. And the reason I think that is when you take a look at the favorables and the negatives, when you look at the positives and the negatives of a leader, it's really hard to build those negatives back up once they're down. People rarely ever do it. And Pierre Poilievre's negatives are really bad. And when you look at polling, the only reason that that the Conservatives and the Liberals are neck to neck right now is the Conservative Party. It's the credibility that the Conservative Party has and the brand that the Conservative Party has. It's not Pierre Poilievre right now when you're taking a look at those numbers. So totally agree with Brian that he's been able to go get young people in a way that we have not seen in this country since 2015 to line up with him and as really like on that things are different for me. I don't have the same opportunities as maybe my parents did, etc. But he's completely lost, folks who have been voting Conservative their whole life. I think of people in my own family who, for the first time in their life, voted Red not because they don't like the Conservatives, but they cannot vote for Pierre Poilievre because they cannot stomach the things that he says. So I think that group of folks, when you've got somebody like Mark Carney, who's a lot more to the center than maybe Justin Trudeau was, I don't know how you bring those people back without getting rid of your leader. And, the funny thing about Aaron O'Toole is if Aaron O'Toole hadn't been kicked out, he's prime minister right now. I have no doubt that Mark Carney never even puts his name in the ring. And we would have Prime Minister Aaron O'Toole right now if that hadn't happened a few years ago. I think the interesting thing about Pierre and as a comms person, you never want your leader to be somebody that they're not. You want them to lean in on who they are because that authenticity is important. But I think a lot of people have said, I don't like this guy. I don't trust this guy. I don't like the things that he focuses on. And for women in particular, I think they have their backs up and they really just don't like his approach. The snide comments a lot of the time, it seems impossible for him to say a nice thing about anybody. And in this time of folks really want us to find a way to work together because the things outside of Canada are so terrifying to a lot of people. I think a lot of people who are used to voting for Conservatives, folks who may have even voted for Doug Ford in Ontario, are taking a look at Mark Carney because they just can't stomach Pierre Poilievre. And I keep hearing, from folks, I've heard it so much in the last 2 weeks. Can you imagine if Pierre Poilievre was our prime minister right now? How would he be handling Trump? How would he be handling the diversification of relationships? How would he have been handled at Davos? He probably wouldn't have gone. So all of those moments that folks are rallying around and really the adult in the room, we trust this guy because he has the trust in those important rooms. I think everybody being on Team Canada is not a thing that we're seeing right now. And I don't think that that's something that you can fix if you're unable to figure out what it is that you're saying in contrast to Carney. I think Brian made some really good points about the Liberals have kind of lost the plot as it relates to cost of living, but I don't think that the Conservatives have a good thing to say about it right now. You're still hearing about this hidden carbon tax and all of that, and you keep being like, I don't know what you're talking about, man, but it's not something that I'm seeing. So the conflicting of, I haven't figured out what it is that I'm saying. I haven't figured out what about Carney I like that he's doing, and I'm able to say this is a good thing, and I'm going to hold your feet to the fire to make sure you keep doing it. And what are the things that he's not doing that I can take on as an opportunity? I don't think they've done any of that. And I'm always a little bit back up against the wall when it seems like a leader in a party hasn't done any soul searching and isn't able to say, the last election result, we were proud by the gains that we got, but it wasn't enough. And we're upset about this thing, and we're going to correct, and we're going to be better the next time. If you're not able to have the reflection and to say, this is what we're going to do differently, people don't like that. People like seeing that you've learned your lessons and you're going to do better. So I think the leaning in on that, or the doubling down on that, is a mistake for Pierre. I think obviously he's going to handedly win his leadership, but I don't think, even if President Trump isn't the issue in the next election, I don't see how he takes a run at it the way that he was able to this time, other than a complete collapse from the Liberals.
And I'm just thinking back, I guess, it feels like eons ago, but in late 2024, when we saw this Conservative surge, even in Quebec, it definitely kind of, crested. But I'm curious to know, like, when it comes to Pierre Poilievre, Quebec seems to be the potential Achilles heel for Mark Carney. Is there an opening for Pierre there, or is he just like, such a polarizing figure, and his type of politics won't really win over a lot of Quebecers, and there's not much opportunity for them to grow beyond the, I think, 11 seats they won in the last election?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's going to hurt Carney potentially in Quebec is, again, like the lack of understanding of the history that he showed during the cabinet retreat speech, and then maybe the pipeline politics. And I don't know that Poilievre is going to score better on that front for Quebecers. So I think for the next year anyway, a lot of the focus in Quebec is going to be on provincial politics. And I don't know that there's going to be that much breathing room for, do we like Poilievre still or not? Yeah, that would be my take.
Fair.
I am not a Quebecer, but I would ask you guys, is it a fair assumption to say that the opportunity, if Carney does have a setback in Quebec, goes to the Bloc?
And the NDP, potentially whoever NDP is in Montreal.
I mean, so far, none of the potential leaders speak French. That's bound to hurt. So I definitely see gains for the Bloc, and I think the Bloc is also seeing potential gains and capitalizing on some of the things that will be unpopular in Quebec that Carney will do. We saw that with the MOU with Alberta, and we definitely saw that over the last weekend at the Parti Québécois conference with Bloc Québécois MPs also in attendance, really seizing on this that Carney did in Quebec City.
I feel like we are already over an hour, so I will not try to drag this out any longer. But before I let everyone go, I do want to let everyone have an opportunity to kind of say some parting words, whether, it's something, we are missing, something you're looking forward to, just anything that you want to discuss as we close out the program. Brian, when we start with you.
Great. Look, I think one of the big things we're going to see, I think we need to see this week, and it'd be interesting in this session of Parliament, is the tone. I don't think Pierre Poilievre can change who he is, but I think they can take a more constructive approach to what they're doing in Parliament, to not necessarily throw everything at an invisible carbon tax, maybe have a little more debate around the substance of some of the legislation and bills to show Canadians that you're ready as an opposition. Part of that honestly has to come from probably some change to the leadership style. Like, you can't change who Pierre is, but you don't have to have the same faces saying the same things all the time to Canadians. And I think that that is something that the Conservatives need to show as opposition, is that they're willing to be a constructive opposition, pass things that, like the GST rebate that's coming up, if it seems like it's good policy and it's something you can get behind. I think they got to show a different tone. And I think that will go a ways in helping them potentially show who they are.
Yeah, and I think, to Brian's point, the fact that the Conservatives said yesterday, we don't love this, but it's better than the status quo, so we're going to let it slide. Same thing with the bail bills. So maybe they're listening to you, Brian, and they're taking your advice already.
Well, but they said that, but Andrew Scheer had to take about 7 shots at old Trudeau policy as he said it. Like, that's not the tone they're looking for. I've seen conservative opposition leaders come into provincial legislatures, or even Prime Minister Harper. I remember when he was in opposition, it was, is this good for Canada? Here are the reasons why. We're going to back this budget. Here are the reasons why it's not. We're not going to support it. Like, it's not always about the same carbon tax, invisible carbon tax, industrial carbon tax, whatever carbon tax. Like, let's show some breadth and knowledge as an opposition party, I believe is important.
I think the key messages need to be revised and turn up the garbage I mean, he could continue, actually. I take that back. Continue doing all the things that you're doing. That's great. I don't want to sound Pollyanna, because I am obviously in politics because I want to win. But the thing that I'll pick up on from what Brian said is the constructive. I think Canadians sent us all a message last election and said they wanted us to find a way to work together. And I think we're seeing that with the provinces. I think the time that we're in is really important for the direction of our country for, years to come. And this, space that we have between the US and as it relates to our supply chains, as it relates to everything, from when we wake up to when we go to bed at night. I think it's an opportunity to genuinely build in Canada, to genuinely build our country up, build our workforce up, and to do all sorts of good things. That's going to take parties working together, but it's also going to take parties saying, this did not miss the moment. This did not make the moment. This missed the moment. And you need to do better here and here. And don't forget working people here, etc. So I think the constructive tone is an important one, because I think people are expecting that of us. They're expecting their MPs to work together, to disagree, but to work together. And I think that's what I'm looking for this year is where do we turn the rhetoric into actually improving stuff. And I think setting each party apart in that disagreement and improvement of stuff. And I think that's what will really be interesting this year is what can we actually get done and what can we make better? And I think those are still opportunities for the opposition in that moment. It doesn't mean, the government just gets the path to doing these things. I think that there's a real opportunity to show the importance of having a healthy opposition and to show voters exactly that. But again, with the mandate of find a way to make this work, I think is the clear message that we got from people.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe the cheeriness that we saw in the first day will continue throughout the sitting. I think we're all a bit skeptical about that. Aya, what about you? What are your parting words?
We did put out a story last week about how the mandate of the Major Projects Office might be bigger than what was initially pitched to Canadians. And to explain that, we looked at how the staff there is getting involved in projects that are not referred to the Major Projects Office. They're not in internal lists of briefings of potential major projects or nation building projects. They're smaller projects that are not on any kind of radar, but the Major Projects Office is involved, especially when it comes to Indigenous engagement, Indigenous consultation. And I've been hearing from industry proponents that they're on lots of calls. And there's nothing unusual about that. Like you want a government agency that's set up to improve collaboration between departments to be on calls. But I do think that they are going into some projects with guidance from the courts about how to create meaningful engagement with First Nations. And I think they're taking on big tasks behind the scenes that we have yet to see. So definitely look forward to doing some reporting on that as the year unfolds.
Yeah, very good point. I think for me, I guess, the affordability announcement we saw on Monday, obviously it's going to have a big impact for people who can qualify for the GST credit. It's not many people. It's 12 million Canadians. I shouldn't undercut that, but it's simply targeted towards people who probably need the help the most. But I don't think we've seen much in terms of an affordability message from this government targeted towards middle-class Canadians. Again, to everyone's point, how do you build those strategies that Aya's flag? How do you translate that into something tangible for Canadians? I don't know if there is an easy path to do that. I don't know if there's a simple kind of switch that you turn it on and off. I don't think it's something even as simple as a tax cut that will resonate with people. So how do you do that? I think it's still really, really trying. But I think to Brian's point, the longer this goes on, the longer that we continue to be feeling this, intense pinch of affordability, as long as housing prices remain astronomical, as long as we're not really seeing much, kind of drag on grocery prices, I think it's going to become a bigger and bigger liability. I don't know if there's a simple answer, but someone's got to put forward some compelling vision for what this government is going to do to make your life more affordable for the average middle-class Canadian. And it's not just the Liberals that need an answer, it's the Conservatives, it's the NDP. And that's the one thing that I hope that I'm definitely going to be focusing on as a reporter. I think generally speaking, I think that's really something all Canadians want to hear from their politicians. Well, Melanie, thank you so much for joining us. Aya, as always, what a wonderful contribution. Brian and I will be back on your screens next week. Thank you for watching or listening wherever you are, and have a great week.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.